Hi, welcome to the Open Security Summit session in December 2022. And we have Filip, who's actually going to talk about one of the areas that we really should be paying a lot more attention these days, which is low code and how to actually manage permissions in that world, which, it's one of those technologies that brings a lot of potential and a lot of amazing ways to create better user experience and automate a lot of things, but also can create all sorts of, security vulnerabilities and security permissions nightmare. So Filip, we're really looking forward to this and to learning more about low code and access control in that world. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I mean, like it was mentioned, today I'm going to discuss the low code access control, and more importantly, because it's such a difficult concept in itself, and it's such a concept that it's very hard to sometimes even grasp by a developer. We're going to discuss how kind of we can make that as approachable to every developer out there, and as possible, and maybe not just even the developers, but even people that are part of the team, like product managers and so on and so forth, to be able to kind of configure policies and manage authorization in that space. So I think before I start, it's only good that I actually give a brief introduction about myself, so you actually know who I am. So my name is Filip Grebowski. I am the developer advocate at Permit.io, but you might actually know me as developer Filip. I do run a fairly successful YouTube channel that maybe you have seen before, maybe you haven't, but here I am representing my company and making sure that you understand how authorization works and you understand the importance of it. Just going back a few years, maybe, I graduated university just over 3.5 years ago. As I was at university, I moved to a year to California, to the Bay Area, to work with Cisco. And that's kind of where my engineering career started. And then I proceeded to work with Cisco through my university. And after I graduated and I studied computer science with artificial intelligence, I graduated and I continued working with Cisco until, my YouTube and everything kind of really started, becoming successful to me, realize that maybe the developer advocate role is something that might be worth for me to taking up. Another quick fact about myself, I was named top 100 most influential people shaping British technology in 2019 by the Business Insider. And that was because of a project that we created while we were in the Bay Area. It was an open source music player that was renowned worldwide before Apple even released theirs. It gained over 400,000 users on the app and people were just talking about it. So I think it's always nice to start with a quick fact. So that's a fact about myself. And I think without any further ado, now that I gave that introduction, I think it's only right to kind of introduce you into the permission world. But I think we should take it step by step. So we should actually kind of move through it and dive deeper into the whole subject by first starting off with why building software is complex. And then as a quick overview, then we're going to talk about why permissions are difficult. What's the difficulty that stands behind permissions? Why is it a thing that's starting to become much more prominent in the security world? Then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the whole identity access management waterfall. What is identity management? What is authentication, authorization? And then how do you implement that into your product, and why is it necessary maybe to not do it yourself and not to bake in that homebrew solution? Then we're going to talk about the general global move to low code and no code, and we're going to base it on some examples that are quite interesting, and you'll see how the world of technology has evolved to become much more accessible and much more less complex for everyone. And then we're going to talk about the permit's secret sauce. So what we offer as a full stack authorization solution, how you can implement us very quickly into your application, and how you can really abstract that complex world of permissions to only a few lines of code and a no code UI that allows you to manage those policies in a matter of seconds. And then, of course, we're going to do the demo. I do have to say one thing about the demo, that currently we have a team at a conference that's using this demo throughout the whole day. So maybe some things might change throughout the demo as we see them, because there might be some other person using it. Of course, it's a shared system, but hopefully it should go as smoothly as hopefully the rest of this presentation will. So building software is complex. It's a thing that really started to evolve recently. And I think one of the things that we should mention here and we should really highlight is the fact that previously, a few years ago, it was fairly common to see a monolith architecture. It was fairly common to see software be built on a specific one code base that has all the applications beside it coupled together, and then obviously implementing authentication, authorization, and all other kind of developer tools within that was fairly complex, and essentially just maintaining a whole monolith system was quite complex. So then our world started to evolve. We started to find new solutions, and that's where kind of microservices came in, where we split all different kind of independent components of an application to different, more manageable chunks. It's an abstract way of maybe calling it that. And essentially, we split the front end from the back end. We split the front end API from the back end API. We deal with data control and databases separately. And all of that kind of structure really puts a lot of pressure, maybe on this case, when we're talking about access control, on actually giving the right permissions to the specific users. Previously, with a monolith app, because it was a single code base, maybe controlling those permissions might have been easier, because essentially you do have access to this whole application in one kind of, maybe for like visual reasons, repository, and you can access and control everything there and give permissions, maybe a little bit simpler. But when monolith architectures were still possible, actually access control wasn't that relevant. There wasn't that much pressure put onto it. And now we've got these microservices with security going up higher, and different rules that we have to follow and standards that we have to apply to those services as per the security and controlling the data and making sure everything works are increasing. And therefore, obviously, implementing access control specifically into each component gets much more difficult, because you might have a user at a company that could deal with specific tasks within one microservice, but could not deal with tasks in a different microservice. And you need to have that permission in place. Now, I think a big part here is to mention that just in general, building permissions is very difficult, and it requires a lot of thought process, and it requires a lot of kind of implementation to be able to make sure that when you build a solution, it can scale, and it can scale with a microservice architecture. And that's something we're going to discuss a little later on when we dive into why permissions are very difficult and what can we do to abstract from them and make them a little bit simpler. And that's it. There we go. We've got the section. So I think there is 3 parts to why permissions are difficult and why we should kind of abstract and what we have to deal with. And we're going to cover 3 sections here. And the first one is infrastructure. Like I've mentioned, we started to have microservice architectures, obviously many different services that we have to manage in one point, and we have to provide the right permissions to each one of those services and treat it as a separate kind of container that's running in our architecture that needs its own permissions, and that should technically, be visible globally across the whole system. Then, of course, we have third-party services. We have things like maybe billing with Stripe, or we might have analytics, or we might have different databases where we have to control the data. And that already starts to really make that world of permissions much more complex and much harder to kind of create a cornerstone for when you're designing a system. And then, of course, we have devices at the edge, things like IoT devices, phones, and so on and so forth. And it's when you're thinking about all of that technology and all of that infrastructure that you have to implement permissions for, implement access control for, make sure that the right user has the right roles, and the right roles have the right resources, and the right resources have the right actions, and then making sure that all of these are very granular and you start to scale them. Wow, it's a lot to grasp about. And most people think of permissions as simply admin and not admin. That's kind of the simple explanation here. Then, if they want to expand on top of that, they expand and talk about admin, not admin, and super admin, admin, not admin, super admin, and manager, viewer. And that's kind of where it ends. But actually, permissions dive much deeper into the whole concept. So here we have dealing with different policies. Now, policies are things that you have to consider when you're building access control. And like I've mentioned, most people think of permissions as maybe admin and not admin. And actually, a fair few know about RBAC, so role-based access control. But then it spans even further than that. You have relationship-based access control, or RBAC. You have attribute-based access control, or ABAC. And so right now, when you're thinking, oh, well, how do I make sure that this user has the right role? Well, it gets very complicated. And I'd love to give you an example of maybe a difference between what an RBAC policy might look like and what an ABAC policy might look like. So let's imagine that we have an administrator, and this administrator wants to delete a document and have that permission to do so. Now, the way you would phrase in words the permission of what an RBAC is administrator X has permission to delete document Y. Now, actually, if we want to dive deeper and we want to create an ABAC policy, and I'll show you how complex this can get. So you might define an ABAC policy as administrator X, who is located in continental US and is specifically in the Department of Engineering can only delete document X, which has 60 pages, and he can only delete it between 9 and 5 p.m. Now, of course, this is a very, very crazy example, but that's a permission that maybe you might have to implement. And that's where kind of maybe ABAC would come in, where you specify, where you give each user more attributes and you give each resource more attributes. And then obviously those permissions become much more granular and it's very, very hard to control. And like I've mentioned in my example, you have things like many different data sources that you have to manage. So all those resources that you have to provide, it might not just be one, it might be thousands of different resources within a company that a user or a specific role might have access to or might not have access to. It could be the combination of whether time is correct, whether the user is in the right location, whether the user is in the right department, whether the user is a contractor or maybe a full-time employee. You know, these permissions can span on and go on forever with complexity. And it's just how hard does it actually get to scale? Now, I'll give you a simple example. When I used to work at Cisco, within Cisco internally, I used to lead a team and manage the production of the internal dashboards. Now, as part of these dashboards, every single dashboard was essentially its own thing, its own service, its own application. And now within each dashboard, we have different requirements to maybe have these users that are able to control more than the other users that might be using the application. And this was not only for maybe users who are in the specific team, this would span for maybe users who are in a different department who might have more granular permissions or maybe more abstracted permissions. And this would be users who are maybe, associated with the whole product that we are working on. Now, of course, that within Cisco was quite complex because we ended up building a solution for each one of those services separately. So that's not really a way right now that you would consider of managing permissions. It's actually a very complex way, and it's super, time consuming for the developers. Instead of focusing on the actual product and bringing actual value to the product, you end up having these developers work on something that maybe there's a solution out there that already exists. Another example is our CEO, or he in his previous company, Rookout, he rebuilt access control 5 times in a matter of 3 years when the company wasn't even 3 years old. Now that really says something about permissions. And every time he had to rescale it, every time he had to rebuild it, he needed to scale the permissions because there were just more requirements that he had to adhere to that maybe he didn't think of before. Now, the last thing is dealing with security and compliance when you build permissions. Now, at Permit, we have a lot of clients that, for example, are in the fintech space, are banks, or in the medical space. So they have very high compliance. Not only that they require data to be extremely safe, but they also need specific compliance like HIPAA, like SOC 2 type compliant or SOC 2 type 2, or GDPR, or the data has to be in the correct location. It makes it very difficult. And when building that system, you also have to take this into consideration. Do you need to audit logs? Do you need to provide the correct privacy? The security has to, and the whole application that's, the authorization service, it has to be performant. It has to always kind of offer that support to those companies, because, you can't imagine a healthcare company, not working or not having the access to the right data or not being performant enough. And this list also continues to go on and on and on. So I think this kind of gives you a really brief explanation of how complex permissions actually can get and how difficult access control can be. So now, giving those permissions, if I asked one of you guys to, hey, go ahead and write me a homebrew solution that deals with permissions and authorization, I'm pretty sure most of you would say, well, let me find some tool that already does this for me and makes it much easier so I can actually focus on my product. And that's really, it's the case of, you have the possibility to build your own authorization, but why would you do it if you have all these different resources available that really help you manage all this complexity? Now, kind of going away from permissions, I'd like to take a more wide angle aspect and actually just talk in general about the global move, like I've called it here, to low code and no code solutions. And I think there has been like a really big boom of companies recently implementing this in their system. But I'd like to go back in history a little bit as well and kind of give you some cool, interesting examples where we really see this global move of these solutions, especially no code solutions, in action. And the first example I'd like to mention is with websites. Previously, a few years ago, if you were a business, if you were a startup owner and you wanted to build a website, you would have to physically hire a developer to build this website for you, and it would take a larger amount of time. And of course, other services that were out there which offered this website building, they had a very limited base of people that actually wanted their service. Yes, of course, there's a lot of businesses that allow you to build websites and offer that service. But essentially, it's about making it available to everyone. And the way that those companies knew that they can grow, that they can scale, that they can access a bigger market of people is to provide a solution that maybe is less intensive on the coding size. Of course, we have to understand that not everyone is technical, and some people are not technical at all. So how do we take this further, and how do we dive into this technology to really abstract from the complexity, to really simplify the whole process and give people, the possibility of creating something on their own? And I think the first companies that we have noticed this with was website creation companies, things like Shopify, Webflow, Wix, right? You see all these companies offering people the possibility of creating their own website, which instantly markets a whole huge amount of people that maybe previously didn't want to create their website, but now they can, and they can do it themselves. And they don't need the help of a developer. They don't need to ask a developer for any changes because they can just do it themselves. And they've made it available to the whole world. And I think that really opened the eyes of many other companies, especially in the developer tool space, where these companies thought, well, actually, why would I make this so complex for the developer? Why don't I develop a solution that's very simple, is very abstract? It involves a very minute amount of code that you just implement into your application, and suddenly you have all that functionality that you wanted for. And again, like I said, and I'll repeat this over and over again, you can finally decide and focus on the actual value of your product. One interesting thing I saw recently, it was a Twitter post, and it's becoming more popular, that someone posted saying, hey, now in 2022, you can create your own business and you don't have to have any technical knowledge. You can just use all these no-code solutions and you cover the whole aspect, from managing data to creating websites to shipping things to managing data security and so on and so forth, to like automating processes. And it just seems crazy. And now what we have is this huge access to the whole world, and everyone who's not even technical that can create everything from scratch and use all these services that implemented this no-code solution. Now, actually diving a little bit deeper into the whole authentication space, or into the whole identity access management space. And actually, I have here an example of different companies that implement this no-code solution. But diving into the specific of authentication space, I think a few years ago, I remember writing a project that involved me writing an authentication system in PHP. And it was just to authenticate if the user is allowed to access the portal or not. Now, of course, that started to become a really big thing in developer tools and in different applications where a user has to log in, where they have to create an account to be able to access the right data. Now, of course, that has started to really expand, and developers, as they used to build their homebrew solutions, and finally that shift came along where, it was not worth it to do that. Security went up, compliance increased, and suddenly it's too difficult to dedicate a whole team to focus on building an authentication solution when you can just take something that's already in the market, plug it, play it, and automatically it works. And that's exactly what happened with companies like Auth0, with AWS Cognito, Super Tokens, FusionAuth. There's so many authentication providers out there right now that give you this flexibility of just really quickly embedding a piece of code, and suddenly everything works and you can authenticate a user. You can store their session. You can create a session for them. You can store their information in a cookie and expire it after so many X hours or whatever. And, the configuration there is endless. So now I think that I've touched on authentication. I gave you a brief example of what authentication and how it has essentially evolved. I think if I just show you the waterfall, there's essentially two parts to the authentication covered by the identity management, which is almost like an umbrella term for authentication and authorization. Now, identity management is essentially making sure and kind of covering the concepts that the right user accesses the right data and then gets issued the right roles to perform actions within your system. Now, of course, like I've mentioned, you have the authentication, which is identifying a user and making sure that their identity is the one that matches with who they actually are. And I think a nice example of that is that, for example, let's say a person is ordering some concert tickets online, right? And those concert tickets are ordered and they are issued for pickup. Now you have this person picking up to the booth. They go up to the booth and the gentleman or the lady asks them to prove and provide a form of identity to make sure that the name of the ticket actually matches who they are in real life. And that's essentially what authentication does, and any authentication provider provides. They give you that kind of source of truth and make sure that the right user has the right identity to access the system. Now, moving on this identity access management waterfall, then we have things like authorization, giving the users the right roles to be able to perform the right actions on the right resources. And this is kind of where Permit also comes in. Permit is a full stack authentication solution. It's an application level solution that allows you to embed snippets of code within your application and control access by giving you this no-code UI for controlling policies that get updated in real time and therefore give you a result whether the user can or cannot access the specific resources within your system. So I think it's only fair that I now jump into discussing, Permit's secret sauce and essentially what Permit does and why Permit might be a relevant option for you to pick when it comes to the authorization space, and picking that solution that allows you to solve this authorization problem really, really quickly and actually focus on the main value of your product. So there is three things that we have within Permit. Of course, we call it a low-code solution, and we call it a low-code solution because we ask you to embed those snippets of code. We call it the permit.check function, which takes the specific user, the action, and the resource, and it returns that result with you. And you would place it within your code where you want to check against that specific policy that you configured for that specific role that the user that has logged in for your authentication provider has received. Now I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into maybe the code, and then once I show you, I'll explain how that identity gets passed along. But let's just cover these three topics first before we dive deeper into that actual concept. So
and Filip, just a quick question. But the base of all this is open source technology, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, correct.
Yeah, that's quite important because it means there's a level of not locked in, which is quite important, right? And I think you guys provide a service on top of it, but it's really cool that the fundamental, OPAL and OPA and all that stuff is actually, in fact, we had a really good session on Tuesday on OPA and how to scale that stuff. So yeah, good stuff.
Sure, yeah. So I'll touch on the open source aspect as well, and I'll explain why it might be really relevant, and not just for any authorization solution but just for companies that are using open source to be able to do that. And there's actually a very valid reason why you would want to implement open source. Anyway, jumping onto the second point, it's the experiences and why experiences are valid here. When we're providing services to other companies, obviously you want to focus on the fact that the UI, the experience of that user is very easy, is very simple to use, and it's very abstract. So the complexity of security, the complexity of authorization gets abstracted, and it's offered as a very simple management tool that allows you to kind of adopt the way you use the system very fast, and allows you to essentially have everyone involved within your team, like I've mentioned previously, maybe product managers who might want to configure policies. And then jumping into the open source. And I think this is a really, really interesting part of authorization. As you probably know, or you maybe heard of, authorization is structured upon OPA. OPA is like an open policy engine. It's almost becoming a standard of building permissions with Rego code. Now, Rego code in itself is, fairly difficult. You have to write a bunch of code, which essentially then translates into a policy that is hard for developers. It takes time. It takes time to understand. It takes time to write. And it takes time to essentially make sure that the policies that you've written are actually correct. Now, what we did and what we tried to do within Permit is actually build an open source project on top of OPA called OPAL, the Open Policy Administration Layer, which essentially drives real-time updates to OPA which means that whenever you're changing the policies with our no-code UI, so it could be someone from your team just ticking the boxes for the specific role and making sure the actions are in place, as soon as you click save, that open policy administration layer, that new policy gets sent over the WebSocket connection, and essentially that new policy updates in real time within the PDP, which I'll get onto in a second, which we call the policy decision point within permit. And what that allows you to do is it drives those real-time updates to that OPA policies, the Rego code. It configures the real code in real time. It writes the policies for you. So it abstracts that whole kind of process of having the developers sit down and learn how to use Rego code and make sure that he understands how to configure these policies, especially when maybe they're RBAC policies or even harder ABAC policies. And essentially it does it in a matter of seconds. And that's kind of solves a really, really big problem for you. Now, the thing with using open source, and I think this is more of a fact for any kind of, developer tool company or any kind of PLG company, is the fact that you have a really good fundamental thing to base your company on, especially with startups. I think making sure that that open source projects are the fundamentals of your company, it really gives more security to the clients that might be using your company. It really kind of reinforces the fact that what you have, and for example, if maybe a company that introduces, let's assume there is a company that runs its, its code base and its system on an open source project. If that project or if that company was ever to fail and not work, when the companies have that security of being able to base, and still continue to run their project with those Rego code policies and transfer them somewhere else if they need be, because it's based on this on OPA, which is almost, like I've mentioned, a standard for creating those policies right now. Now, I think specifically when it comes to permit, there's a few steps that might somewhat be considered difficult, but how we abstract it is very important. So within permit, you obviously define that policy, and I'll show you in the demo how simple that is to do. But as you define that policy, so you create your roles, you create your actions and resources that you want to perform those actions on, and you assign your user. And I think the assigning of user comes in here when you're using your authentication solution. So let's assume that you're using Auth0 and you're authenticating a user into the system. As soon as you're authenticating the user, you can sync that user into permit. And essentially what that syncing does is it takes the JSON web token, it takes out the unique identifier of that user, and it puts it into permit. And that's the user that's already exists into permit. So as soon as the next time, for example, that user logs in for your authentication solution into your system, and you have the permit, enforcement point set up within your application, then of course, that user relates to that enforcement point. That user has a specific role that you have assigned, and then therefore that role gets recognized. That request gets sent to that microservice that we give to you, which I'll talk about in a second, and the benefits of that as well. And then, of course, that request gets returned saying whether the user can or cannot access that policy. And of course, as you're doing all of this, as you're defining this whole policy, that Rego code gets generated in real time and makes it very simple. Now, there is a whole case of not just within permit, but within any other solutions, any other no-code and low-code solutions that really focuses on the aspect of why it should be really fast and simple to use. And I think we've noticed with a lot of developers these days, and with a lot of trends right now, with any kind of developer tool or any product that implies and it makes use of this low-code and no-code solution, that everything, not only that it has to be easy, it also has to be fast for the developer to use. So I know there is, for example, a company that does authentication called clerk.dev. And what they do is essentially for you to, not just for you to be able to control which user is logged in, but for you to get the whole settings panel for that user, what devices they are currently logged into, where the sessions exist, all their information, multi-factor authentication, and so on and so forth. That all of that code that you have to configure within your app is free little kind of elements that you have to embed within your application. Literally just copy and embed, And that solves the whole thing for you. And suddenly you have all of this out of the box that works with your application. And what it took you like 5 minutes to configure. And that's really, really the power of these low code and no code solutions, to really make sure that not only that they're so abstracted from the actual complexity, especially when it comes to security, which is very difficult, but also the implementation can be really fast. So that value of that product and the fact that, again, you can focus on building your product and focus on the value of your product can be achieved and focused on much faster. Now, we have a quote here that says that a single developer can upgrade the entire product with 10,000 of users to use Permit in production within a few weeks. And actually, we had a testimonial that we did with a company called Honeycomb. They're a big insurance broker in the US. And essentially, they had one developer that they hired to transfer thousands of roles within the system. And he was able to do that single-handedly in just a matter of 3 days, which, just proves the point that not just with Permit itself, but just with no code and low code, that essentially this whole process can be made so much easier. Then why would you end up having to write your homebrew solution and making it so complex for yourself to create the system when you don't have to? Now, here is a very simple example of essentially what you have to do with Permit and how fast it is. We'll give you a Docker image that you just pull and you deploy with the API key that you get from after you log into Permit. And essentially, that's your PDP running, your policy decision point. And I think there is 3 really big benefits that we see with the PDP when we kind of designed our architecture. And these are points that, are usually, or any kind of authorization company should really kind of understand, and it covers some basic concepts that are quite relevant, especially when you really want to increase this market to companies that are maybe in fintech, banking, and healthcare, and so on and so forth. So the first thing is that this PDP, it's essentially a Docker image that you deploy as a sidecar in your own architecture. And when you update those policies within the Permit UI, there is absolutely zero latency. Those policies are real time because of Opal, the open source project, the open policy administration layer. And that really makes those updates, updating the policy instant because it's running in your own system. So checking for policies, updating policies, it almost equates to 0 milliseconds. Secondly, we have no access to data. So I think this is a very important thing, especially for companies, or especially if you decide to build your own or use a third-party service that does authorization, is the fact that the data that you handle. So for example, I'll show you an example after this where we have that permit.check function, which takes a user. Like I've mentioned, what the standard is and what you should use is take the unique identifier from that JSON Web Token to not reveal any sensitive and personal information. Also, when we have any data, we don't store that data, but we provide instructions of where to fetch that data. And I think that's another really important point when it comes to actually, making sure that you're compliant with all these standards when it comes to access control. Then, of course, finally, is the concept that—
Sorry, Filip,
yeah,
can I just ask you a question?
sure.
But you still make the call, right? You still make a call per request to get a policy, right?
Yes, so all the policies actually, what they do is, and that's the third point, all the policies that you configure are stored in this policy decision point in your own architecture. All those policies are cached. So even if there's
yeah, but I'm saying, but by the way, this is a feature. I'm not saying it as a problem because,
right.
For example, if you look at the Jira or the Atlassian problem we had this week, I don't know if you heard about where there was a gap and they, Atlassian was not checking if the tokens were not, were not authenticated. So basically it's an interesting actually blind spot from a security point of view, where what happened was Atlassian was not checking if the session was still valid, right? So what it means that even if you logged out, if somebody had stolen the cookies, right, you could still reuse it. And then, of course, the interesting thing was it was then sold in the black market, authenticated sessions that even if you had logged out, you can still log in. And that for me is this thing, something I've seen in a lot of places where it's done for performance reasons. But I think you guys addressed this here, where basically, you do the authorization on a GWT token because you don't have access to a central location to check the policy, right?
Exactly.
So you have no way to make sure the policy and the session and all things is still valid because you've delegated to the edges, which are to the microservices. So the power of this is that you cache it, you make it insanely fast, but there's still a real-time check if the user still has access to that.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Those enforcement points within your application check in real time as the user is using the system to make sure that the current ID or the current identifier is matching the JSON Web Token that they're currently logged in with. Yes, so there wouldn't be any issues where that session would run out, that user wouldn't be logged in, but you could still get access to those to specific areas in the application that might correspond to the role that you have. Yes, absolutely.
And the reason why those designs sometimes occur is because it's very hard to build what you describe it, because this becomes a single point of failure, right? But if you design it well, it also becomes a great place to control identities. I'm not sure you're going to cover this, but I also love to use this kind of data for monitoring and figuring out patterns of attacks, because then you start to have patterns of what good users look like, because you start to see the pattern of users of the application. So then you can pick the outliers, right? So it's really cool to have that. But cool.
Exactly. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's a valid point, and it's good that you're mentioning that. So I mean, actually, when I show you later on in the app, we have something called audit logs, and it's essentially you have access into everything that's happening and all those permissions that are checked at the particular time for a specific unique ID of that user that's currently logged in, which really could allow you to check for those patterns and see the user activity and things that are happening within the system.
Yeah. And by the way, that is insanely valuable for the business. Right?
Extremely valuable.
Where you just described. Forget about security. It's still, of course, massively valuable for security. But if you can start to provide information about how the app is actually used and how the patterns flow within the application, that's insane value for business.
Yeah, so I mean, audit logs right now are fairly simple. It's just showing you at what time and what day this specific user did this permission on this resource, and has it been denied or has it passed, right? But of course, you can take that a lot further and start to really analyze those things, which is very interesting. And just security in general and patterns and making sure looking out for maybe suspicious behavior and things like that. It's a whole another world of different very, very interesting things that you can really write software to control and to get insight into. So for sure, yes, absolutely. So now actually going back into this what you see on the screen right now is a very simple permit.check function. That's essentially the enforcement point I've been talking about all this time. It's very simple function that you just embed anywhere where you want to give that control, make sure that that user is or has the rights to perform those things. So what you'll see is that we have this permit.check function, and it takes 3 parameters. It takes the unique user. In this case, we provided an email just for visual purposes, but this should be that unique identifier from the JSON Web Token that you're checking for. It takes the current action that the user is performing on the current resource, in this case, document. And that essentially goes over that WebSocket connection to the policy decision point. The policy decision point looks at that Rego code cached policy, and it checks, well, this user with this role, can this role have access to creating the document? And then it's going to send back the request to your application saying, well, it can perform this document, or no, this user is denied, and that user should definitely not have access to performing this. So, that's that security feature that's implemented here. So now that I've kind of dived into the whole world of permissions and why no code and low code is very important and why software is difficult and why permissions are becoming more difficult, I think it's only right to give you a very, very short demo to show you, one, how easy it is to create new roles and to configure new resources and actions, but also secondly, just to show you how fast those updates are being updated within Permit to give you that control in your application, to essentially allow your product manager or someone that may be non-technical on your team to control these policies, tick those boxes, say those changes, and suddenly have control over the users that use the system. So I'm just going
but just a little curveball here, but can you also create them using codes from
yes,
JSON
absolutely.
or YAML on a repo file?
Absolutely. So I think
Very
the
cool.
standard here is that if a company is offering some no-code or low-code solution, they should always, as a standard, also provide a full API for controlling everything within this dashboard. Of course, because you can't always depend on a dashboard, or most companies have the requirement to automate certain tasks and make sure that those tasks are done really fast rather than actually requiring a user to log in. So yes, of course, we do provide an API, and we also provide a bunch of different SDKs for different languages as a standard, just for you to just to even make this implementation even easier for the developers to really save that time and make sure that they have this POC running in no time.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm just going to transfer over to a simple demo. I'll just refresh this and refresh this to make sure that there has been no updates. Awesome. Okay. Oh, and there we go. We're somewhere abroad in this in this background. Anyway, we have a very simple to-do app, and essentially this to-do app allows me to create new tasks. Or just whatever I write, I can check those specific tasks. I can edit the names of those tasks. So essentially, the task is, in this case, the resource, and the actions I'm performing are the actions that I can apply on that resource. And I'm currently logged in as a user who has the administrator role. So now if I actually try and delete one of these tasks, I'm able to do that. But for example, if I just make sure that this environment is correct, okay, so users administrator. So what you can see within the permit UI is that I've got the users panel, and I've got myself configured here. And I've got myself as added as a user that has the administrator role. Now, if we actually go onto the policy, what you'll see is that I, as a user, and this actually spans not just role-based access control, but attribute-based access control. Even though the complexity of them differs so much, you actually still control them for the same UI here. And actually, if I'll just uncheck the check task, so uncheck this ABAC policy, which we don't have to worry about now because that gets a little bit more complex, and we'll just focus on the very simple RBAC policies, what you'll be able to see, I deleted that policy, and if I save those changes, that policy updates in real time. And suddenly, as an administrator, if I try and delete this task, I don't have access to doing that. So essentially, that permission to delete those tasks have been taken away from me. Now, of course, in the same way, I'll do it once again. If I, for example, want the administrator now to be able to delete those new tasks that I create, I can just check this delete policy here for the administrator for the resource called task. I can save those changes. I can go back to the UI. And now if I actually try and delete this, well, I have the access to do so already. So you can see how instant and how fast it is and how simple and how much it actually abstracts for those policies. Now, I think one other thing I'd like to show here, which I think is quite important, is just how you can add those new roles and how you can really expand how, the roles that you offer within your system. And it's as simple as just creating a new role. And maybe for this purpose, we're just going to call it I'm just going to call it ABC so it appears at the top. So we have this role ABC that does something. And as you can see, whenever we create this role, all the resources that are already available in the system, because we are working with a specific project in permit, and obviously within that project, we probably want those roles to be able to do specific tasks in that system. What you'll be able to see is that we essentially inherit all those tasks that have been, or those resources that have already been configured. And let's say that I want my role ABC only to just be able to create tasks and to be able to update those tasks. And we can save those changes. And of course, that policy gets updated. And some user, for example, in this case, maybe Asaf, who's our co-founder and CTO, maybe he wants to have a different role. So we can give him that new role called ABC, and suddenly he won't be able to perform most things. But so when that permit.check function actually occurs, of course, he will only be permitted to do the things that we defined in this new policy for this new role. Just touching on another aspect that I've mentioned previously that we've mentioned, we have those audit logs to see what user can do what as for a specific time and date. So for example, if I wanted to see all the requests that have been denied, I'll be able to see them here. I'll be able to see the timestamp, the specific user ID of that person, the action that that person performed on what resource, and the result of that PDP query or that policy when it comes to that permit.check function. Okay, and I think as per the demo, that's kind of the complex stuff of permit, as I shall say. They're not really that complex. It's actually fairly simple. So I think right now, if I just go back to sharing my screen and I'll jump into the presentation, I think the last slide here is any questions, and I'll be happy to take them from anyone if anyone has any questions.
No, this is really cool. Really good to see the evolution. So I have a couple. I don't think there's been anybody has questions. Please send us on a chat. But I don't think I have seen any other ones. So in terms of those no-code platforms, which ones have you seen? That working, right? What's some good examples of those platforms?
So there is many. So these no-code platforms now, I think they're mostly covered under every single, as I would call it, genre of tech. So for example, when it comes to authentication, I think clerk.dev does a really, really amazing job. And there is even a video on YouTube where they show you how to do it in like 5 minutes. And the results are very, very impressive. Of course, you've got all the website creation platforms. So for example, you have a Webflow, which allows you to create these really, really creative and interactive websites, absolutely with no knowledge of code at all, right? Of course, then you have things like Stripe, who now actually is moving onto a low-code solution where you can, for example, create a whole Stripe checkout by simply just implementing and injecting a chunk of, an embeddable chunk of code that they provide for you. And suddenly when your user clicks on that pay button that they also provide for you as an element, suddenly you have this whole checkout, the user enters the details and you get the payment, and it's almost configurable in like 15 minutes. So I think a lot of companies, these are quite, different examples from different spaces that are implementing the no code, low code kind of aspect. And it's really, really working for them, because now you have a lot of people that maybe build a whole website with Webflow. And then that's an interesting part. All these kind of no-code solutions that are out in the market, they're starting to create integrations. And for example, Webflow has an integration with Stripe. Webflow has an integration with Shopify to give you that maybe e-commerce aspect suddenly out of the box. And actually, Webflow probably even takes it further, and they don't even ask you to take that code snippet and put it into your website. They just do it for you. So suddenly, like I've mentioned before, you have all these all these solutions where you can implement the whole business and not even know or write a single line of code, which is very, very interesting. And it's very interesting how the world is kind of moving forward with that. Not even mentioning the whole AI aspect and how much AI will be able to do for you in the future. I think that's a whole another subject, but it's very, very interesting in how the world is kind of revolving into implementing these solutions really, really fast to give like amazing results.
Cool. So that's some good questions. Cesar or Mel, you guys able to unmute? Do you want me to ask the question? Let's see. Is Mel?
Yeah, so I'm wondering about how much value this brings to a situation where you may be trying to instruct developers on how they can integrate multiple complex data flows between multiple vendors in multiple cloud environments, using diverse sets of APIs to be able to make one application work.
Right. So just to clarify your question, so you're asking how would developers essentially manage doing all of that, or how they would kind of find those solutions? Can you elaborate?
Well, I'm interested both in the developer perspective as to how they can integrate the solution into what they're building, but also from an administrative perspective, where you have, let's say, for example, in AWS environment where you have multiple services to manage. And I see that OPA does have some ability to integrate with some AWS services. Wondering what's the overall state of practice, if we narrow the question down a little bit, try to make it a little easier to grasp. What's the overall state of practice in say using multiple services across AWS,
right,
with multiple APIs and to your custom app, and users who need complex permissions, as well as the applications themselves need complex permissions to access data in these different services.
Right. So first of all, I think it really comes down to the point when you're building an application, and for example, you're dealing with all these microservices, and you're looking for these services that kind of will ease your development. The case is that you're building a product that you're trying to deliver, and it has a certain value, and you're trying to provide that value to either customers or either developers, depending what your product is. Now, in the cases where there is a solution out there that offers that to you and really allows you to save the time, and for example, maybe you're just starting out and you really have to consider, actually that's another thing, and I'm going to touch on that in a second, but in general, the general answer is that when you see a problem that is hard to solve, and there is a team out there, of a team of experts that's already developed this product that does this for you and allows you to implement it very quickly with little hassle, that then later on will drive a lot of value to your product, that's the time where you should really consider looking at your options and maybe trying to implement it. Now, the case here is that further on, when you're building a system, obviously there is certain steps that you take, and you can be at different stages. Maybe you already have a solution that you did, a homebrew solution that you have already created within your system that works for you, but maybe there is a solution out there that's offered that's takes it that step further and allows you to scale a little more. Now, the question is here, which solution do you go with? Do you continue expanding your homebrew solution and developing the efforts of developers to do that? Is it worth it? Or do you kind of maybe transfer everything and dedicate those efforts of developers, maybe, which might be a little more efforts because you're essentially getting rid of a solution that you've already pre-built and moving on to something different? But I think the focus here is, how will that impact you in the long run? Is it necessary? Will this bring value to your product? And value is essentially what you really have to focus on. Sometimes done is better than perfect, but in certain situations where you can really see, for example, in this case with authorization, the security of applications becoming a very prominent thing and something that almost becomes a standard that you have to embed into your applications, well, maybe now it's the time to actually move and change to a solution like, for example, something that manages your authorization. It doesn't have to be permit, it could be something else. Or basing your system on OPA, which is, like I mentioned, almost a standard for building policies within your system. Now, the other thing you've mentioned is about managing different applications within, AWS. And I think one point to touch on here is that when you're, for example, specifically with authorization, when you're looking for different solutions, there's different solutions in the authorization space. They might be solutions that are infrastructure-based authorization, or there might be things like permit, which are application-level authorization services. Infrastructure are more to do with managing different containers and giving people maybe access to different containers and different services in the cloud. Of course, with permit, it's more application level. Within the certain application that you're creating, can maybe the user delete another user, right? And this is kind of diving more into the concept of authorization for authorization and difficulty that holds within itself. But in general, I think, like I've mentioned, just to summarize, whenever you see an opportunity that will save you time and provide value in the long run, you should probably consider kind of moving along with that. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, it's a complex question, and I understand.
It is, of course.
The answer really is going to boil down to the specifics for each application, each organization, yeah. And so it sounds like the answer is use it where it makes sense.
Yes, use it where it actually not even makes sense, but use it where it will provide that value. And I think the value is a very important word here, because that's essentially what you're driving towards, right? That's what you want to create essentially in the long run. That's what your end goal is. So if you can reach that value faster for the end user that you're creating the software for, well, absolutely.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
So one of the other questions was, you might answer a little bit, is how do you connect this with Azure, with the low code stuff in Azure?
So Azure is so we're talking about the authentication solution within Azure, right?
I'm assuming so.
Okay, so permit works with any authentication provider, whatever it might be, as long as that authentication provider, and I think it's pretty much every single one right now, provides you that JSON Web Token, you can very easily integrate it with the permit in the same exact way that I've described. So whatever that authentication solution might be, every authentication solution out there, to what I'm aware, gives you a JSON Web Token, and you can extract that unique identifier of the user from that JSON Web Token. Then you can use any authentication solution with permit.
Cool. Brilliant, man. I think that's it for questions.
Awesome.
Any final remarks?
Yeah, so if any of you guys are interested in the authentication space, if you just want to discuss maybe something that you're working on, it doesn't have to be permit related, it can be OPA related, it can be OPAL related, it can just be access control related. You're more than welcome to join our Slack. We're more than happy to just have a cool developer discussion with you and talk about the cool tech and stuff that maybe might be relevant to your space and the thing you're creating. If you need advice on maybe picking authentication solutions, maybe other authorization solutions, we're also really open to helping you in that space. So make sure you join the Slack. And of course, if you want to chat more about permit and maybe see how it works and how it would work with your current solution that you're implementing, always feel free to arrange a call with us. We're more than happy to just chat and kind of give you a further explanation.
Brilliant. Thanks for doing this session, and let's organize a couple more for the next summit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. I hope it was insightful. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the future ones, maybe.
Brilliant.
Thank you.